The attic had always been Mia's sanctuary, a quiet refuge where time seemed to stand still among dusty boxes and forgotten memories. On this particular autumn afternoon, golden light filtered through the small window, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards as she sorted through her mother's old belongings. Her sister Ellie was supposed to be helping, but at 16, she'd found more interest in her phone than in what she dismissed as ancient history. "Mom wants this done before dinner," Mia called down, her voice echoing through the house. The response was a noncommittal grunt from somewhere below. Sighing, she turned back to the task at hand. The box before her contained photographs from the 1990s, their colors slightly faded but still vibrant enough to tell stories of moments long past. Her mother, Catherine, looked so young in these images, her smile carefree in a way Mia rarely saw nowadays. Then she found it, a photograph that made her breath catch in her throat. The image showed her mother standing beside a man Mia had never seen before. They were at what appeared to be a beach house, the man's arm draped casually around Catherine's shoulders. But it wasn't their posture that made Mia's hands tremble, it was the man's face. The same prominent cheekbones, the same slightly upturned nose, the same warm brown eyes that Mia saw every day when she looked at her sister Ellie. "Hey, what's taking so long up there?" Ellie's voice drifted up the stairs, followed by the sound of footsteps. "Mom's getting impatient." Mia quickly slipped the photograph into her pocket, her heart racing. "Just finishing up," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. As Ellie's head appeared through the attic entrance, Mia couldn't help but stare at her sister's features that now seemed to belong to a stranger in an old photograph. That evening, during dinner, Mia watched her parents with new eyes. Her father, James, sat at his usual place at the head of the table, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed work emails on his phone. He'd always been the predictable one, home by 6, Sunday golf, holiday traditions that never varied. How many of those traditions had been built on secrets? Her mother moved around the kitchen with her usual efficiency, but Mia noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she served the pasta, the way her smile seemed fixed when Ellie complained about her homework. Had she always been this tense, or was Mia just seeing it now? "Mom," Mia said suddenly, pulling the photograph from her pocket. "I found this today." "Who's the man in the picture?" The sound of a plate shattering against the kitchen floor broke the evening's quiet routine. Catherine stood frozen, her face drained of color, staring at the photograph in Mia's hand as if it were a venomous snake. James looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something Mia had never seen before, fear. "It's nothing," Catherine said quickly, too quickly, bending to clean up the broken plate. "Just an old colleague from work. From before you were born." "Mom, you're bleeding," Ellie said, pointing to where Catherine had cut her finger on the broken ceramic. But Catherine didn't seem to notice the blood. Her eyes were fixed on James, who had risen from his chair and was now standing with his hands gripping the back of it, his knuckles white. "Catherine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't." The tension in the room was suffocating. Ellie looked between her parents, confusion evident on her face, that face that now seemed to hold so many questions. "I think," Catherine said finally, her voice shaking, "that this conversation needs to wait for another time." "No," Mia insisted, standing up. "I think we need to talk about this now. Because this man, he looks exactly like Ellie. And I want to know why." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, a car alarm went off in the distance, its wailing creating an appropriate soundtrack for the moment when Mia watched her family's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Her father turned and walked out of the room without a word, the sound of his study door slamming echoing through the house like a gunshot. Ellie sat perfectly still, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide as she processed her sister's words. Catherine remained on the floor, blood dripping from her cut finger onto the broken pieces of the plate, creating a pattern that looked like abstract art, beautiful and terrible all at once. And Mia stood there, holding the photograph that had just shattered her family's perfect surface, wondering if some truths were better left buried in dusty attic boxes, hidden away from the light of day. But it was too late now. The question had been asked, the wound had been opened, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sleep eluded Ellie that night. She lay in her bed, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror across the room, studying features she'd always taken for granted. The curve of her nose, the arch of her eyebrows, were they really someone else's legacy? The thought made her stomach twist into knots. From downstairs came the muffled sounds of her parents arguing. They'd been at it for hours, their voices rising and falling like waves against the shore, sometimes crashing loud enough for words to break through the floorboards. "You promised we'd never." Her mother's voice, thick with tears. "How dare you bring this up now?" Her father's response, sharp with barely contained fury. Ellie pressed her pillow against her ears, but the words still seeped through, poisonous and unavoidable. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Mia stood in the doorway, her face pale in the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Mia asked, though it wasn't really a question. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of Ellie's bed, just as she used to do when they were little and thunderstorms kept them awake. "Do you think?" Ellie's voice cracked. She swallowed hard and tried again. "Do you think Dad knows that I'm not?" "Hey," Mia reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it tight. "You're my sister. Nothing changes that. Not some old photo, not whatever they're arguing about down there. Nothing." A crash from downstairs made them both flinch. The arguing had reached a crescendo. "I did what I had to do." Their mother's voice, clearer now. "You weren't there, James. You have no idea what it was like. I've spent 16 years raising her as my own, Catherine. 16 years of lies." Ellie's hand trembled in Mia's grasp. "I think I'm going to be sick," she whispered, and bolted for the bathroom. Mia followed, holding back her sister's hair as she retched, rubbing circles on her back just like their mother used to do when they were sick as children. When Ellie had nothing left to give, she sat back against the cool tile wall, tears streaming down her face. "I need to know," she said quietly. "I need to know everything." Mia nodded, her own eyes burning with unshed tears. "We'll figure it out together. First thing tomorrow, we start digging. There has to be more evidence in the attic, letters, documents, something. What if we don't like what we find?" Ellie's voice was small, childlike. Before Mia could answer, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house, followed by the roar of their father's car engine starting up. Through the bathroom window, they watched his headlights disappear down the street. They found their mother in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of wine, staring at the photograph that had started it all. When they entered, she quickly wiped her eyes, trying to summon a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Girls, I'm so sorry about all this. Maybe we should just forget about Dash." "No." Ellie's voice was stronger than she felt. "I deserve to know the truth. About him." She pointed to the man in the photo. "About who I really am." Catherine's hand shook so badly that wine sloshed over the rim of her glass. "You're my daughter," she whispered fiercely. "That's who you really are. That's all that matters." "That's not enough anymore, Mom," Mia said, her voice gentle but firm. "We need answers. Real ones." Their mother looked between them, her face a battlefield of emotions, fear, love, desperation, resignation. Finally, she took a deep breath and reached for her phone. "There's someone I need to call first," she said. "Someone who can help explain everything." Her fingers hovered over the keypad. "But once I make this call, there's no going back. Are you sure this is what you want?" Ellie and Mia exchanged a look, years of sisterly understanding passing between them in a single glance. Then Ellie stepped forward and placed her hand over her mother's phone. "We're sure," she said. "But first, tell us his name. At least give us that." Catherine closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His name is Thomas. Thomas Blackwood. And he was more than just a colleague." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Outside, a distant roll of thunder promised a storm, as if nature itself was responding to the tension in the room. Ellie felt the weight of the name, her real father's name, settle into her bones, changing her understanding of herself with each passing second. "Make the call, Mom," Mia said softly, wrapping an arm around her sister's shoulders. "It's time for the truth to come out." As Catherine dialed the number with trembling fingers, none of them could have known that this late-night kitchen confession was just the beginning. The real storm, with all its devastating revelations and life-altering consequences, was still gathering strength, waiting to break over their heads and wash away every certainty they'd ever known. Dawn found Mia back in the attic, this time with purpose rather than routine. Her mother's call the previous night had gone unanswered, leaving them suspended in a liminal space between truth and secrets. The morning light revealed dust motes dancing in the air as she methodically went through box after box, each yellowed envelope and faded photograph another potential piece of the puzzle. Her fingers brushed against a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, tucked beneath layers of old tax returns and Christmas cards. The paper was brittle with age, the ink slightly smeared in places where tears had once fallen. The first letter was dated 16 years ago, just months before Ellie was born. "Dearest Catherine," it began, and Mia's heart clenched at the tenderness in those two simple words. "I understand your decision, though it breaks my heart. James can give you the stability I never could, the life you deserve. But please, remember that my love for you and our child will never diminish." The sound of footsteps on the attic stairs made her quickly tuck the letter into her pocket. It was her father, looking older than she'd ever seen him. His clothes were rumpled from sleeping in his car, his eyes red-rimmed from tears or lack of sleep, perhaps both. "Dad," she began, but he held up a hand. "Before you say anything else, I need you to understand something." His voice was raw, vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "When your mother told me about the pregnancy, about Thomas, I had a choice to make. And I chose to love that baby, to love Ellie, as my own. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to." Mia felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Why didn't you ever tell her? We thought we were protecting her." He sank down onto an old trunk, his shoulders slumping. "Your mother was so young when she met Thomas. He was brilliant, charismatic, everything I wasn't. But he was also unstable, prone to disappearing for months at a time, leaving her to pick up the pieces." The letter in Mia's pocket seemed to burn against her skin. "Did you love Mom? Even knowing about Thomas?" "I loved her enough to wait," he said softly. "I loved her enough to be there when he wasn't. And when she finally chose me, I promised her we'd build a life where she'd never have to worry about being abandoned again." He looked up at Mia, his eyes filled with a lifetime of complicated emotions. "I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting our family from the past. But maybe I was just protecting myself from the fear of losing everything I held dear." Downstairs, they heard the front door open and close, followed by Ellie's voice calling out. She'd gone for an early morning run, her way of trying to outpace the chaos that had engulfed their lives. James stood up quickly, wiping his eyes. "Dad," Mia caught his arm. "She needs to hear this from you. The whole truth, including the part about how much you love her." Before he could respond, Catherine's voice drifted up from below, tight with anxiety. "James. Mia. You need to come down here. Now." They descended to find Ellie standing in the living room, her running clothes soaked with sweat, her face pale. Next to her was an elderly woman none of them recognized, her silver hair elegantly styled, her posture regal despite her advanced age. "I'm Margaret Blackwood," the woman announced, her voice carrying the weight of years and unspoken histories. Thomas was my son. And I believe it's time we had a long overdue conversation about the choices we've all made. Catherine sank into the nearest chair, her hand pressed against her mouth. James moved instinctively to stand behind her, his presence both protective and uncertain. Mia watched as Ellie took a step toward Margaret, their eyes meeting in a moment of profound recognition. "I have his eyes," Ellie whispered, and Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. "You have so much more than that, my dear," Margaret replied softly. "You have his spirit, his resilience. And you deserve to know why he never had the chance to tell you himself." The letter in Mia's pocket seemed heavier now, laden with secrets that were finally ready to see the light of day. As Margaret settled onto the sofa, her handbag clutched tightly in her lap, the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the tears on everyone's faces, tears of fear, of relief, of anticipation for truths long buried. The time for hiding was over. The time for healing was about to begin. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the leather portfolio she'd brought, revealing a lifetime of carefully preserved memories. Her fingers traced the edge of a photograph, Thomas at his college graduation, his smile bright with promise and possibility. "My son," she began, her voice steady despite her shaking hands, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his early 20s. He was brilliant, passionate, but the illness made his life unpredictable. When he met Catherine, it was during one of his brightest periods. Catherine sat perfectly still, her fingers intertwined with James's, as if drawing strength from his presence. "He made me feel alive," she whispered. "Everything seemed possible when I was with him." "But the heights never lasted," Margaret continued, pulling out another photograph, Thomas at a beach house, the same one from the photo that had started everything. "The depression would come, dark and overwhelming. He'd disappear for weeks, sometimes months. Catherine, my dear, you were so young, trying to hold on to someone who couldn't even hold on to himself." Ellie sat on the floor at Margaret's feet, absorbing every word, every nuance of expression. "What happened to him?" she asked softly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He took his own life 3 years ago. But before he did, he wrote this." She withdrew an envelope, the paper thick and expensive. "It's for you, Ellie. He wrote one every year on your birthday, though he never sent them. I found them after he was gone." The room fell silent as Ellie took the envelope with trembling fingers. Mia moved to sit beside her sister, their shoulders touching in silent support. The only sound was the gentle rustle of paper as Ellie opened the letter. "My dearest daughter," she read aloud, her voice catching. "Another year has passed, and I still carry the weight of the choice I made. Your mother was right to choose stability, to choose James, to protect you from the chaos that follows me like a shadow. But know this, my love for you has never wavered, never dimmed. It is the one pure thing in my complicated life." Ellie's voice broke. Mia wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders as she continued reading silently, tears falling onto the carefully penned words. Catherine slid from her chair to kneel before her daughter. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "When I discovered I was pregnant, Thomas was in the middle of a severe depressive episode. He disappeared again, and I was terrified. James." She looked up at her husband, love and gratitude mixing with guilt in her eyes. James had always been there, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. When he offered to marry me, to raise you as his own, it felt like salvation. "But you lied to me," Ellie said, the words sharp with pain. "All of you lied." "We did," James spoke up, his voice heavy with regret. "We thought we were protecting you, but we were wrong. You deserved the truth, even if it was complicated, even if it hurt. I just—" He took a shaking breath. "I was so afraid that if you knew, I'd lose you. Because you're my daughter, Ellie, in every way that matters. Biology be damned." Margaret reached into her portfolio one last time. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. Thomas left a trust fund for you. He may not have been present in your life, but he never stopped thinking about your future. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, making it hard to breathe. Ellie stood abruptly, the letter clutched to her chest. I need some time, she said, backing away from them all. This is too much. I can't. She turned and fled up the stairs, the sound of her bedroom door slamming echoing through the house. Mia started to follow, but Catherine caught her arm. Let her process, she said softly. We've had years to live with these truths. She's had less than a day. Margaret stood, gathering her belongings with dignified grace. I'll leave these with you, she said, placing the portfolio on the coffee table. There are more letters, more photographs. When Ellie's ready, they'll help her understand who her father was, both his beauty and his struggles. As she moved toward the door, she paused beside Catherine. He loved you, you know. Even at the end, he spoke of you with such tenderness. But he was proud of you for choosing life, for choosing hope. She smiled sadly. And James, thank you for being the father my son couldn't be. After Margaret left, the house fell into a heavy silence. The morning sun had given way to clouds, casting the room in shadows that seemed fitting for the weight of revelations still settling around them. Mia picked up the portfolio, feeling the weight of untold stories in her hands. Upstairs, they could hear the muffled sound of Ellie crying. The sound tore at their hearts, but they remained where they were, respecting her need for space while carrying the burden of knowing that sometimes, the truth, no matter how carefully revealed, could still feel like a betrayal. The days that followed Margaret's visit passed in a delicate dance of avoidance and tentative connection. Ellie spent hours in her room, emerging only for necessities, her father's letters constant companions in her self-imposed exile. Each page revealed another piece of Thomas's soul, his struggles, his dreams, his deep and abiding love for a daughter he'd never known. Mia found herself becoming the family's bridge, carrying messages and meals between closed doors, watching as the people she loved most struggled to find their way back to each other. She spent her evenings in the attic, methodically going through Margaret's portfolio, piecing together a history that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. One evening, she discovered a journal hidden beneath the photographs. The entries, written in Thomas's flowing script, painted a portrait of a man fighting desperately against the darkness in his mind, trying to protect those he loved from his own storms. I saw Catherine today, one entry read. She was with him, James. They looked peaceful. The kind of peace I could never give her. The baby is due soon. My child. Our child. But I know now that love sometimes means letting go, even when every fiber of your being screams to hold on. A soft knock at the attic door interrupted her reading. Ellie stood there, wrapped in an oversized sweater, looking younger than her 16 years. I heard you up here, she said quietly. Can I join you? Mia nodded, making space among the scattered papers. Ellie settled beside her, picking up one of the photographs, Thomas at a piano, his fingers suspended over the keys, his face caught in a moment of pure joy. He was a musician, Ellie said softly. Like me. Did you know that's why Mom enrolled me in piano lessons? She said it was because I showed early aptitude, but... She traced her father's image with a gentle finger. She was giving me a piece of him, wasn't she? Even if she couldn't tell me the truth. Mom's love for you was never a lie, Mia replied, wrapping an arm around her sister's shoulders. Neither was Dad's. They just got lost in their fear of losing you. Ellie leaned into her sister's embrace. I found Mom crying in the garden this morning. She was holding one of my old baby blankets, just sobbing. I wanted to go to her, but I didn't know how. Everything feels different now, like I'm seeing my whole life through a warped lens. Different doesn't mean broken, Mia said gently. Maybe it just means more complete, even if that completeness comes with pain. Below them, they heard the front door open, their father returning from another long day at work. His footsteps paused at the bottom of the attic stairs. "Girls," his voice carried up, tentative and hopeful. "Your mother's made lasagna. The good kind, with extra cheese." It was an olive branch, offered in the language of family dinners and normal routines. Ellie tensed slightly, then relaxed. "We should go down," she whispered. I think I'm ready to talk. About everything." They found their parents in the kitchen, moving around each other with the careful choreography of people trying to rebuild trust. Catherine was pulling the lasagna from the oven, her hands steady now where they had trembled days before. James was setting the table, for places, as always, but somehow the familiar arrangement felt more deliberate, more precious. "Before we eat," Ellie said, her voice quiet but firm, "I need to say something." They all froze, holding their breath. Ellie pulled Thomas's last letter from her pocket, smoothing it gently. "I understand why you made the choices you did," she began, looking at each of them in turn. "I understand that love can be complicated, that sometimes we hurt people trying to protect them. Thomas, my biological father, he understood that too. He wrote about it in every letter. About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back, let someone else be the parent your child needs." Catherine made a soft, broken sound. James moved to support her, but Ellie held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. Dad," she turned to James, tears shining in her eyes, "you chose to love me. Every day, you chose me. That's not nothing. That's everything. And Mom," her voice softened, "you chose to give me stability, safety, a chance at a normal life. You both chose love, even when it meant carrying the weight of secrets." She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'm still angry. I'm still hurt. But I'm also grateful. Grateful for the family we are, even as I grieve for the father I never knew. And I think that's okay. To hold both those truths at once." The kitchen was silent except for the quiet sounds of tears. Then Catherine stepped forward, opening her arms. Ellie hesitated for just a moment before stepping into her mother's embrace. James and Mia moved as one, enfolding them both, their family circle complete yet forever changed. As they held each other, the setting sun painted the kitchen in shades of gold, casting long shadows that seemed less threatening now, more like reminders that even in darkness, light finds a way to persist. On the counter, Thomas's letter lay open, his words a testament to the many faces of love, the love that stays, the love that lets go, and the love that builds bridges across the chasms of pain and truth. Autumn had returned to the neighborhood, painting the trees in shades of amber and gold. A year had passed since the discovery of that fateful photograph, year of gentle healing and careful reconstruction of what family meant. Mia stood in the attic once again, but this time she wasn't alone. Margaret Blackwood sat in an old armchair they brought up, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light. Together, they were sorting through Thomas's belongings, sheet music, journals, photographs, preparing them for Ellie's 17th birthday. "He would have loved to hear her play," Margaret said softly, running her fingers over a worn composition book filled with Thomas's handwritten scores. "She has his gift for making the piano sing." Downstairs, as if in response, the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major drifted up through the floorboards. Ellie had been practicing for weeks, preparing for a special performance at the local concert hall. It would be her first public recital since learning the truth about her father. "Some days," Mia confided, carefully placing another stack of letters in an archival box, "I catch Mom standing in the doorway while Ellie plays, and there's this look on her face, like she's seeing both of them at once, Thomas and Ellie, past and present merging into something beautiful instead of painful." Margaret nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Grief has a way of transforming, doesn't it? What starts as a wound becomes a channel for love to flow through in new ways." The music from below swelled, Ellie's interpretation carrying all the complexity of her journey, the pain of discovery, the struggle for understanding, the gradual acceptance of a truth that had both broken and expanded her heart. "I found this yesterday," Margaret said, pulling a small velvet box from her bag. It was Thomas's mother's ring. "He kept it all these years, hoping." She paused, emotion catching in her throat. "Well, hoping for a moment that never came. But I think Ellie should have it now. A reminder that she comes from a line of survivors, of people who loved deeply, even when that love came with great cost." The piano music faded to a gentle close, followed by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Ellie appeared in the attic doorway, her face flushed from playing, her eyes bright with purpose. "I want to visit him," she announced quietly. "His grave. I think I'm ready." Margaret rose slowly from her chair, crossing the room to embrace her granddaughter. "He would be so proud of you, dear heart. Not just your music, but your courage in facing all of this with such grace." "We'll all go," Mia said, watching as their mother appeared behind Ellie, James's steadying presence right beside her. "As a family." The next morning dawned clear and crisp. They gathered at the cemetery, their breaths visible in the cool air. Thomas's headstone was simple, elegant, much like the music he'd written. Ellie knelt before it, placing a bouquet of white roses and a copy of her upcoming recital program. "I used to think family was something fixed and unchangeable," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But now I understand it's more like a symphony, complex, evolving, beautiful even in its discordant moments. I have two fathers, one who gave me life and his love of music, and one who chose me every day, teaching me about unconditional love through his actions." She turned to James, who had been hanging back slightly, still sometimes uncertain of his place in these moments. "Dad," she said, reaching for his hand, "would you help me up?" The simple request carried the weight of forgiveness, of acceptance, of love that had been tested but emerged stronger. James stepped forward, taking her hand, and they stood together before Thomas's grave, the father who raised her and the father who loved her from afar, no longer in competition but part of the same profound story. Catherine moved to stand beside them, her fingers intertwining with James's free hand. Mia joined them, completing their circle around Ellie. Margaret watched from a few steps back, her heart full at the sight of this family that had found a way to expand rather than break. "I brought something else," Ellie said, pulling a folded paper from her coat. It was sheet music, her first completed composition. At the top, she'd written a dedication, "For my fathers, both of you." Later that evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Ellie sat at the piano. The piece she'd written began softly, like a question seeking answers, then built gradually into a melody that spoke of loss and discovery, pain and healing, and most of all, love in all its complicated forms. As she played, Mia looked around at the faces of her family, her mother's peaceful smile, her father's quiet pride, Margaret's gentle understanding. The photograph that had started it all sat framed on the mantel now, no longer a source of secrets and shame, but a chapter in their family's continuing story. Through the window, the last light of day painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, a reminder that endings could also be beginnings, that truth, though sometimes painful, could set a family free. And as Ellie's music filled the room, it carried the promise of tomorrow, a tomorrow where love wasn't diminished by sharing, where healing wasn't the absence of pain but the presence of hope, where family meant everyone who helped write your heart story.